The world is changing extremely fast right now, in ways that can feel both exciting and overwhelming. So, how do we find balance in all of this? I'm Stephanie Van Bismarck, activist, author, and digital educator. Welcome to my podcast, where each week I sit down with some of the world's best thinkers, trailblazers, and extraordinary people to find ways to help us all thrive and answer the big question, how do we manage? Today we're diving into the mysterious, miraculous machine that is the human brain, with an incredible mind guiding the way. We're joined by Dr. Dwayne Godwin, neuroscientist and science communicator. Together with cartoonist and creator of PhD comics, Jorge Cham, he's authored a fascinating new book called Out of Your Mind, which explores how our brains shape who we are and sometimes fool us in the process. Sadly, Jorge wasn't able to join us for the chat, but Dwayne's brain was just more than enough. Let's get into it. Dr. Dwayne Godwin, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Well, thank you so much for having us, and thank you for your interest in Out of Your Mind.
Yeah, I love that. Let's see how out of our minds we're going to get in our mutual conversations with each other. I mean, in your book, you're tackling really the big questions. The big questions like consciousness and self. How would you define consciousness?
Oh, I guess the way I would define it in one sentence is consciousness is the feeling of being you. So, I don't feel that I'm you, Stephanie, and you don't feel that you're me. You have a unique experience of the world. And that's because our brains developed to have consciousness. And it is because, how we're wired and how our brain development happened is very different. And that, we may have a common structure of our brains, but the environment in which we grew up, the unique experiences that we have, our differences in physicality, because consciousness is also a sensation of how your body is functioning. All of those things are different. And, there are interesting vignettes that we cover in the book that I think also spell out the possibilities that different brain regions bring something very different to the idea of consciousness. And I'm thinking in particular, there's a story about Krista and Tatiana Hogan. And these are craniopagus twins, and these are twins that are conjoined twins, but they're conjoined at the head. Their heads are essentially fused together.
Yeah.
And they have two different sets of brain cortices, the outer wrinkled covering of the brain, but they share some of the central structures. And so we get into, what does it mean that they can sort of feel and sense aspects of each other's consciousness? And I think that's a fascinating and unexplored area for neuroscience, and one that we're quite interested in.
So, I'm always happy, although my younger daughter does study neuroscience, and so I've probably heard a little bit about it in my life, but I'm always happy if complex things are explained in an easy way. But you certainly had an idea around that, why it is important to make these very complex functionings understandable for a broader audience.
Yes.
Why do you think it is so important for us to understand how the brain works?
Well, the brain and our mind is the essence of who we are. One of the reasons that we structured the book the way we did was we felt it was very important not to write a textbook.
Yeah.
And I felt that was something that a lot of people have done and have done very well, where they start with the very basics and they tell you exactly what a brain cell is, how the brain cell works, how they communicate with one another. And they do that for about 2 or 3 chapters, talking about all these different aspects of the brain. And then they get to the meat of what the brain does. What we felt was very important and interesting with this book was to think about it from the perspective of someone who might not be a specialist, who might be, pick the book up, want to look at a chapter, but not really get into the absolute devil of the details of how brains actually function, but are really interested in these larger questions. So for that reason, it's possible to take our book, I fully believe this, and pick up and read it, a single chapter, even the chapter in the back, and completely understand what you're reading. That doesn't mean that we've dumbed it down. What it means is that we've tried to insert information at the time that you need it so that you learn a lot, but you don't realize you're learning. And that's one of the best things about the book to me.
Is there something that you tell your readers and now also the listeners that the brain does as a trick that surprises someone who reads your book or who listens today?
Yeah, one of my favorite chapters, although it's a little dark, is what happens when we die.
Okay.
So that is I don't know that I would call it a trick, but it's a special gift that the brain, I believe, gives us as we're passing away. We go into a great deal of detail about what is known about brain death. And we also look at some of the science related to things like out of body experiences and near death experiences. And we examine that in great detail based on what we know. Fortunately or unfortunately, we can't do things like record people's brains as they're passing away. But what we do know from the few accidents where that's happened is that the brain is doing things. It's not just simply like turning off a light switch when you die. It's actually actively processing information, and certain types of neurochemicals are being released, some of which have great similarities to hallucinogens. And so, I found that to be fascinating. It wasn't an area that I research, but it was an area that I think is of great common interest to people because, all of us wonder what's on the other side. And I wouldn't characterize that we talk about what's on the other side, but what we do talk about in the book is everything that happens right up to that moment. And it's fascinating and wonderful. In terms of other tricks that the brain does, the entire existence of the brain is a trick, if you think about it,
Mhm.
because the brain is not directly uh, perceiving anything. There is no direct route into the brain. Everything is indirect. So, for example, your eyes. Your eyes are processing information from the world. It's taking complex textures and colors and shapes. It is then encoding that in your retina, and then the retina turns that into just basic spikes that are then transmitted centrally to other parts of the brain that then take that code and break it down and interpret it. So our entire existence, in many respects, and the function of the brain itself is in some ways a trick. But it's, rather than a trick, I would say, it is a process. And it's a fascinating process that also leads to things like visual illusions, things that we think are there that are not actually there, and things that we miss in the environment that are there, but we just don't perceive them.
So, talking about reality and what's real is also, a big philosophical question out there. But in terms of science, what do we perceive as real? What is reality?
Well, in scientific terms, I think reality is the simulation that all of us are running within our own brains. If you think about our experiences, everything that we see and feel and smell and touch, and even the sensations of our own body, those are things that are first encoded into electrical activity. And then that is then decoded by different areas of the brain that are responsible for these different sensations and perceptions. So there is, in a very real sense, a couple of ideas out there in the world. One is that we live in a simulation. And when people talk about that, it's really sort of sci fi, and people are proposing that there is this large computer program and all of us are simulated within that program. But I guess to ground this in our own reality and experience, we are running that kind of simulation, but we're doing it in our own brain, in our own mind. And it's a result of all of these processes of decoding information and producing a sort of reality that is in front of us, in front of our eyes, and in the realm of our own touch and sensations.
So, everyone is perceiving reality a little bit different, right?
I think there are things that are common. So if you and I saw blueberries, I think
Okay, yeah.
we could probably agree what color a blueberry was. That it's blue, it's a bit darkish, but what does that mean to us? You and I have both learned this through observation.
Yeah.
Uh, that's the tricky thing about things like consciousness, because we, having visual systems, can agree on things like colors, but we having different consciousnesses may find it very difficult to agree on some sort of external reference of what consciousness is and what that means, because it's so unique to each one of us. So I think from that perspective, there are certain things that, from a reality-based perspective, we can agree upon because we can all observe them at the same time, and we could measure some of their features, and we can come to a common understanding. But there are other aspects of brain function that are somewhat ineffable and are based on feelings, and those are very difficult to come to a common conclusion about.
Going back to a little bit the science, is you read and hear that we use so little of the gray matter that is there in comparison to what is there, or do you think we just haven't fully understood what the rest is for?
Well, I think it's the case that, if you think of the brain as a computer, which I honestly don't really recommend because it's not exactly a computer, but your computer does a lot of wonderful things, but not every aspect and every circuit within your computer is active at any given time. So I feel that the idea that 10% of our brain is accessible to us is not quite true. I think what is really the case is that all parts of your brain are doing something in some aspect of your capacity to exercise your mind and to do things in the world and to accomplish tasks and to remember things. That it's a distributed process that engages different areas of the brain simultaneously. And so I believe, it's um, really a myth that we use only 10% of our brain. We use all of our brain. Even when you're asleep, you're using enormous territory within your brain to generate the rhythms of sleep.
You come from very different backgrounds, Jorge, Cham, and you. How did this collaboration start?
It's a long-standing relationship. We've known each other for over 15 years. So I had him visit our students during a tour of his where he was giving what I would characterize as a wellness chat for our students,
Okay.
which they often appreciate. Mental health is a big concern in graduate education. So we were simply having lunch one day, and we bonded over a common love of science. And eventually the question came up, would it be possible for us to convey what is thought of as one of the most complex organizations of matter in the universe? Could we convey how the brain works using what is thought of as perhaps one of the simpler artistic forms? And so that spawned a collaboration that lasted many years. And we just basically every couple of months generated a one-page comic that dealt with some aspect of brain function from a neuroscience perspective. And it was a lot of fun. It was a challenge because conveying something as complex as, for example, memory in a single page comic with perhaps 500 words maximum is very challenging. It's a different form of communication. People think of comics as sometimes being very childish, but I think these were very adult and very respectful of people and really just tried to be accessible, to make things and concepts that could be very difficult, very accessible to a non-specialist audience.
And why do you think neuroscience and comics work well together?
I believe they work wonderfully together because, if you're familiar with neuroscience and you read some of the popular press on neuroscience, occasionally you'll see these wonderful pictures that show beautiful neurons like a forest. And the way I think about our comics is it's a way to walk through that forest. It's not just simply looking at it from the outside and, just feeling the wonder. It's actually walking through, seeing the details and the creatures that live there and interacting in a more specific and accessible way. Comics allow you to do things that you can't do with just standard photography or even sort of AI generated graphics. It lets you do things like stand in the synapse and let neurotransmitters rain down on you. And you can also look at things and simplify them into concepts, basic concepts that underlie different scientific phenomena. So from that perspective, I think it's a natural.
If your brain was a comic character, what would its superpower be and what would its flaw be?
Well, I'm a professor, so Professor X, I think would of the X-Men would be a favorite of mine because I'm invested in the brain and brain science, and so and Professor X is uh, someone who has a very enhanced brain and telekinetic abilities and that sort of thing.
Okay.
So, and and he also a very thoughtful person. I think, from my perspective, my heroes are kind people. So
Okay.
that's what I'm most interested in.
What would its weak side be?
Oh my, it would be my blind sight, things that I don't see coming at me. So for example, we have a very interesting, you may be aware of this over in England, that we have a very interesting political climate right now.
Oh, yeah.
And many things that I never thought would happen and would be changing or now changing. So that would be my weakness, is probably the lack of capacity to foresee some of these changes that are coming at us so quickly.
Yeah. If there was an exhibit that is titled "The Brain is Lying to You," what would I see there?
Oh my, if you had an exhibit called The Brain is Lying to You, you would probably see a lot of visual illusions because that's what people really love to show, to show how the brain is tricking you, and that you're not actually seeing what you think you're seeing, and also ways to distort your perceptions so that you see things that are not necessarily there. And it would also, I think, deal with this aspect of consciousness. If there was an exhibit on the brain, I'd want to talk about how we know how the brain functions and historically the things that have happened that have taught us so much about the brain. So, for example, there are stories in the book about Phineas Gage, who was a railroad foreman in Cavendish, Vermont, who was building part of the railroad. And there's a very famous story where he was blasting rocks to make way for these paths through the mountains. And the way they did that was they drilled a hole and they placed gunpowder into those holes and then ignited it to split big boulders apart.
Yeah.
He was doing that one day and was using something called a tamping iron, which is about a 1 meter long iron rod. And it ignited, and that boulder essentially became a pistol. And it shot that rod through under his cheek and out the top of his head, and it severed connections between his frontal lobes and the rest of his brain. And we found out so much from his unfortunate accident about the role of the frontal lobes in executive function. And
Okay.
there are just stories like that I think exhibits about the brain would probably go into in great detail. It's really a story about you. It's a book about all of us. And so it's that aspect of it and the questions that we ask. What is addiction? Almost every one of us knows someone in our lives that struggles with addiction. And I believe we break down the process of addiction and why people become addicted in a very accessible and understandable way. And we cap that off with a cartoon, a comic about Sherlock Holmes. Was Sherlock Holmes a drug addict? And we address that problem. And I think we come to a very satisfying conclusion about that question. So,
Do you want to
if,
give a
if
little insight into that? It is highly interesting into Sherlock Holmes and the addiction description.
Yes, well, obviously, Sherlock Holmes' drug of choice was cocaine, which he injected, and we used that as uh, a device to really look at what the process of addiction is and what it means to define someone as being dependent upon drugs or being addicted to drugs. So Holmes famously, author Conan Doyle, had him with this flaw, with this this very large burden that he carried with him throughout all of the stories. And there were allusions to it in several of the stories and Watson's struggle to keep Holmes on track. And we come into a very satisfying conclusion with that eventually Holmes did struggle with this demon, and with the help of his friend, Dr. Watson, he was able to conquer it. But we felt that it was important for people to understand how the normal process and balance of the brain is unbalanced when drugs enter the picture.
That is so important. It's so important for a lot of people to understand what's actually happening with addiction because it can be very difficult to comprehend.
I think we break it down very simply, but also respectfully. Addiction, at least in my way of thinking about it, and many professionals' way of thinking about it, is in a sense an illness, and it is a loss of control. And insidiously, many of the drugs that do produce addiction undermine the normal function of areas that are important to resist taking drugs. So it's a very difficult process to talk about. It's very emotional, to be honest, because I do have people in my life who have struggled with addiction. And so it was very important for me to be very respectful to that struggle.
Yeah, I mean, we all know people somewhere, if not very close by, who are struggling with this. So it's important to understand what's happening.
Well, I hope people will walk away from the book with a sense of wonder and fun. One of the things and one of the reasons we wrote this book was we wanted the brain to be fun and reading about the brain and learning about it to be a fun process. Really approaching the brain from this standpoint of these different questions that most people ask themselves over the course of their lives and might have conversations about over the water cooler. So
I love your book, and I think it's so important because it is fun, and we all learned that if you do something joyful or even playing exclamation marks, but it's playful even at parts, that you learn faster. Something I ask nearly all of my guests, not all of them, but is there a ritual or something you do every day to manage your day better?
when I wake up, I don't pick up the phone.
Ah,
That is the thing that I believe has intruded on our mental capacity almost more than anything else is technology.
yeah,
I believe that it's important to take a few moments every day and ground yourself in your own thoughts rather than, oh, I woke up, let me roll over, look at my phone, see, check my email. It's possible to be connected almost continuously throughout the day.
yeah,
So I feel for my own grounding that I need to take breaks from technology,
yeah.
even though I'm very dependent upon technology, perhaps more so than a typical person. I think it's important to take those breaks, uh, enjoy nature, get out and utilize your brain for what it evolved to do. I'm not sure our brains evolved to use smartphones.
Yeah, I'm not
I,
so sure about that either.
But I think smartphones have certainly learned how to hack our brains in some ways and to keep us engaged with them. So I think fighting that impulse is one of the most important things I do, at least, to sort of keep my mental hygiene and my wits about me.
Yeah, and very smart people came up with that hook, right? They knew exactly what to do in order to get our brains working. But um, it was fabulous to talk to you. Anyone who is not interested about it, this is a fantastic book. It is really intriguing, and you tackle so many of the big, big questions. So, and you make it understandable, which is not easy. I know that because, my daughter and the neuroscience department.
Well, I hope she likes it.
Oh, she loves it. She thrives in it. It's just the mom sometimes, struggling to understand what she's actually doing. But thank you so much for taking your time. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Jorge and I are both very appreciative of your interest in the book, and we hope that others will pick it up and enjoy it as much as you have.
What a fascinating conversation that was with Dwayne. I'm still thinking about the way our brains deceive us, sometimes helpfully, sometimes hilariously, and how art and science can come together to explain the self. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, please make sure to follow the show on your favorite podcast app. It really helps us to reach more curious minds like yours. And while you're at it, leave us a quick review or share this episode with someone who loves science, philosophy, or just a good conversation.